Well, here we are in session number 6 of our study of archaeology in the Bible. Today we'll be talking about the fall of Judah, the exile of its residents due to the Babylonian overthrow, and then their subsequent return to the land. However, first, let's talk a little bit about pottery. So we are firmly in the Iron Age, and we've talked about the different pottery forms, looking at rims and various other aspects of the type of pottery itself. But once we get pretty firmly into the Iron Age, we start to see some other significant differences, and that really kind of comes into the fore with decoration. So we have here a kind of a jug that is from the Israelite areas, and you'll see it's decorated relatively simply, but still decorated. Then we have Philistine bichrome ware, which is really very highly detailed in its decoration, and quite distinctive when compared to the others. And since we will be talking somewhat about the Persians, let's also look at what a bit of Persian pottery of the time frame looks like. This was more like a gray type ware, but you can see the significant differences in the decoration styles and motifs. So you start to see some real differences in the various cultures in the way that they both manufacture their pottery, but especially in the way that they decorate it. So it gets maybe a little bit easier to get those ceramic typologies kind of squared away. So let's, as we have been doing, let's look at some of the problems for this particular time frame for us, and really big problem. And this is a problem that we can look at significantly in this time period, but it's a problem that runs throughout both Old and New Testament, really, and that's prophecy. Scholars have a great deal of problem with prophecy. Now, before we get too deep into that, let's make sure we've got our definitions kind of down. A prophet of God was considered to be someone who gave the message that came from God, and that message does not have to be what we would consider to be prophetic, where it foretells the future. Quite often, the prophets in the Old Testament, especially, are there to call the people back to true worship, to call into question, bad decisions that have been made, and just to really talk to bring the people back to appropriate relationship with Yahweh. But of course, we are going to really focus in on that foretelling the future aspect of things. And really, any scholar who's going to reject supernatural knowledge of events, that scholar is going to reject anything that is put forward as prophecy. So that really means, and if you point to something and say, look, here's an example where this was prophesied and then it was later fulfilled, most any scholar is going to immediately say, well, we reject this supernatural knowledge, therefore this must have been written after it was fulfilled, and somebody kind of went back and said, yes, this was the prophecy. It's kind of the equivalent of shooting an arrow and then painting the target around wherever the arrow hit. So much of these writings that we see in the major prophets and the minor prophets, which is in this kind of tail end portion of the divided monarchy, and then even when Judah is kind of alone after the fall of Israel, much of these writings are going to be exhortations. They're going to be encouraging people to repent of their misconduct. In many cases, especially prophets like Elijah are going to call into question the leadership and particularly the king, and it's going to get pretty pointed in the criticisms there. So again, we look at this time frame, and when we do talk about the foretelling of the future, or most of these prophecies are going to hinge on the fate of Judah. And so you have these prophets like Isaiah and Jeremiah who are pointing out to the people that the days of Judah are numbered and that it's going to be destroyed by the Babylonians. And this is something that no one really wants to hear about. And even beyond that, these prophets will talk about the future of other nations. And then you start to see especially in Isaiah, you start to see the prophecies of a future Messiah, which will have much more impact into New Testament time frame. But nonetheless, this is a huge effort of prophecy. This is where most of that biblical prophecy is all kind of coming in this general time frame. So we put a lot of stock in that as believers. It's a very difficult thing to deal with those who are not. And really, much after the time frame, it's very difficult to authenticate any of these predictive prophecies. You almost have to have like a timestamp on it, which we really don't have in the ancient world. So basically, in terms of prophecy, all we can really do from an archaeological and even a historical sense is to just look for aspects in the writing that show a knowledge and a familiarity with the time that can tell us that it was at least written at a general time frame that was contemporary with the events. Now, another problem that is often raised by critics is the presence of Belshazzar. You may recall Belshazzar is mentioned in Daniel chapter 5 as the ruler in Babylon at the time of the fall of the city. The problem arises that there is no official mention of him in the king lists of Babylonia. So again, scholars and critics have said, well, this is just a made-up individual in the Bible. If you remember a little bit about Daniel chapter 5, the time frame in that was Belshazzar was having a big celebration. He had brought out the sacred vessels that had been stolen from the Jewish temple at the fall of Jerusalem, and they were having a big party. And he's the one who sees the hand of God writing a message on the wall. So that might be a biblical story that you might recall. So how do we find some sort of corroboration for Belshazzar? Well, that would be the Nabonidus cylinder. And you may recall that we talked about Nabonidus a little bit very early on in a session. He was the last king of Babylonia, and he was also an archaeology aficionado. We have some records of some of his archaeological digs. Well, in 1854, this cylinder, the Nabonidus cylinder, was found in the ruins of a ziggurat in Ur, which is in southern Iraq. Again, Nabonidus was the last king of Babylon at the time of its fall to the Persians. On this cylinder is inscribed in the cuneiform writing. It's a prayer, and the prayer includes this following line: "And as for Belshazzar, the eldest son of my offspring, instill reverence for your Godhead in his heart, and may he not commit any religious mistake. May he be sated with a life of plenitude." So what does this tell us? Well, this gives us proof that Belshazzar was Nabonidus' son. So it does establish him as an authentic individual in in the particular time frame. It does establish his relationship with the king. You may even say, based on that, it could give us a feel that Belshazzar maybe had a bit of a wild side, where it says, "Instill reverence for your Godhead in his heart." Um, so that gives us a little bit to go on. But we also have the Nabonidus Chronicle, which is really a part of a larger history of Babylon, and this is tablet number 7, and it tells of an extended 10-year absence of Nabonidus from the capital in Babylon, at which time Belshazzar was named his co-regent, and Belshazzar actually ruled the empire, the Babylonian Empire, at this time. So that could explain why he was considered the ruler in Daniel chapter 5, and it especially could explain why in Daniel 5:7 Belshazzar offers to whomever can read the writing on the wall, offers to make them the third highest official in the empire, which of course the king Nabonidus would have been first, and then Belshazzar would have been second. So he had only the authority to make someone third highest. So again, kind of an interesting aspect that sort of lines up with that. So I think we can feel reasonably good about the authenticity and the historicity of Belshazzar from that time frame. Now, we also have the Bula of Baruch, who was a scribe of Jeremiah. So let's talk a little bit about what a bula is. It's basically if you were to write some sort of a document or something along that line, or seal something up, you would normally take kind of a ball of wax or a ball of wet clay, and you would have like a seal ring that you would push into this, that would leave a distinctive mark, and then it would harden, and that would kind of either seal the document, or you might wrap some cords around it and seal it with the wax or the clay. And it would basically show ownership, and it would also show that something hadn't been tampered with. Now, why do we find this interesting? Well, we have a bula that says that has the name Baruch, and there was an individual in the book of Jeremiah, Jeremiah 36:32, named Baruch, who was a scribe who basically wrote down the book of Jeremiah as it was being dictated to him. So here's what the bula looks like. In the 1970s, two identical bullae, which is the plural of bula, two identical bullae appeared on the antiquities market, and both of them have inscriptions that say belonging to Berechiah, son of Nerahu, the scribe. And this matches exactly the name of the scribe in Jeremiah 36:32, which the biblical passage also mentions the name of his father and the fact that he was a scribe. So this went along for a while. It was very interesting to scholars. Well, in 2014, you have some scholars who declared that it was a forgery, and they claimed this because there were some things about this bula that didn't, or these bullae, that didn't really line up with how most of the bullae are structured. Some markings on them, some of the lettering was a little non-standard, and so forth. So it was declared a forgery. Although in 2016, some other scholars come along and give examples of how, okay, these non-standard things really aren't that non-standard, and we have some other bullae that have these kind of features on them. So and we know these bullae are genuine. So it doesn't necessarily mean this thing's a fake or a forgery. Because again, remember, we talked about this. There seems to be big money in the antiquities market if you can successfully forge something, especially something that maybe has some tie to the Bible. So the the jury's still out. There's all kinds of argument and discussion. So you just really don't know what side to come down on. Now, why is this a challenge? Well, let's talk just a little bit about a term called provenance. And provenance is basically knowing where something came from. Now, remember in this example of the Baruch Bula, it came from the antiquities market. So basically, you don't know where this thing came from. Somebody comes along and says, "Oh, this is genuine." Uh, Provenance in archaeological circles means it's almost like chain of custody or chain of evidence in a in the legal aspect. You can show, I excavated this out of the ground. Here's where it came from. It's genuine. It's not something that just showed up one day that someone could have faked. So that's where the term provenance comes from, and that's why archaeology is so, especially in the Holy Land, is very tied to. There's so many things on the antiquities market that are unprovenanced that it's really very challenging. Versus when you actually dig something up and you can prove that it came straight out of the ground, then there's much less doubt in that regard. So moving from the problems, let's talk about some synchronisms. Let's look at some places where history really lines up. And we spent some time with the Babylonians, and so let's talk about the Babylonian Chronicle. Now, you find we recall we talked about a couple of the societies of the ancient Near East were particularly active in keeping history. The Egyptians are well known for that. What we do know is most of the Egyptian histories are a bit propagandistic. The kings are trying to, make themselves look good and so forth when they're writing down the events. What we find with the Babylonian Chronicle is it's incomplete. We only have part of it, but it is a rarity in the ancient world because it seems to be fairly straightforward history. There's not a whole lot of exaggeration, and the reason we know that, we've been able to corroborate some aspects from from the accounts of other nations, but basically the Babylonian Chronicle tells it like it is. It gives you the bad news. It tells you when Babylonian forces were defeated. It tells you when kings were deposed and so forth. So there's a much higher degree of trust in some of the accounts that are written in the Babylonian Chronicle, and it also covers the reigns of Babylonian kings from about 625 on even through the Hellenistic period after Alexander the Great, when Greek generals would have been ruling this part of Babylon. So, this particular fragment of the Babylonian Chronicle is tablet number 5, and it covers the capture of Jerusalem to the forces of Nebuchadnezzar in 597 BC. So, 597, we need to be conscious of the fact that the Babylonians actually took Jerusalem twice. They took it in 597 and deposed the king Jehoiakim, put him into exile, and took him to Babylon, and put his uncle Zedekiah in his place as king. And this all happened in 2 Kings chapter 24, verses 12 through 17. So this is the first time that the Babylonians took Jerusalem. And bear in mind this name Jehoiakim. We're going to hear it again here in just a few minutes. Also, from this same exact time frame, we have this particular tablet, which is essentially it's a receipt for a donation, a gold donation to the Temple of Marduk in Babylon. It's dated to about 595 BC, which is after the first conquest of Jerusalem, but before the second. And the thing that makes this tablet very unique and very noteworthy is it contains the name Nebo-Sarsekim. And this individual was a very well-known Babylonian official in the army of Nebuchadnezzar, and he is mentioned in Jeremiah chapter 39. So again, a nice little synchronism, a nice little crossover where we have a name from the biblical account, and then we find that same exact name in an archaeological artifact. Something that's also kind of interesting about this artifact, it was discovered in the 1870s. It was eventually sold to the British Museum in 1920. However, it was only translated in 2007. And again, we talked about the thousands upon thousands of cuneiform tablets that are yet to be translated that are in Western museums. This was one of those. So, as promised, let's talk about Jehoiakim and his ration tablet. Again, Jehoiakim was that king who was uh, who was uh, who was dethroned, and he was sent to Babylon. And the book of Second Kings, chapter 25, tells us not only was he sent to Babylon, that he eventually was a part of the king's household, the king of Babylon, and ate at the king's table. So the interesting thing we have here is this particular tablet is was part of a large find from a storehouse that was excavated in Babylon between 1899 and 1917, and they found thousands and thousands of clay tablets. The storehouse, it was a big warehouse essentially, and most of these tablets documented supplies. They were records of inventory and so forth. Well, among these tablets was this particular one, which was a record of the rations that were given to Jehoiakim and his 5 sons. And the tablet even identifies Jehoiakim as the king of Judah. So again, a very nice synchronism here where we see the biblical account crossing over very, very nicely with an archaeological artifact. Now, this one is probably the one that really got me started off being very interested in biblical archaeology, and it's the Cyrus Cylinder. Now, again, we're in this time frame. You'll recall the Babylonians conquered Jerusalem twice, and the second time in 586 BC, they basically destroy it and they exile most everyone, all the middle and upper classes, and kind of disperse them and take a lot of them back to Babylon. Now we know from the books of Ezra and Nehemiah that once the Persians conquered Babylon, they allowed the Jews to return to their homeland, and even were willing to offer support to rebuild the cities and the temples. This is a very unlikely thing. This is a very uncommon thing. You don't see this in history. It doesn't really makes sense. You don't see examples of this previously or really even after. So there was always some question of the biblical account. But then you have the Cyrus Cylinder, which was discovered in 1879, and a portion of the cylinder was resident at the British Museum. Now, funny enough, in 1970, someone actually made the connection. There was a fragment of a cylinder in the collection at Yale University that just so happened to fit the one that was in the British Museum. And so they eventually made copies of them and kind of got them all mated up together there. But the interesting thing about the Cyrus Cylinder is you have this clay cylinder that talks about Cyrus overthrowing the king of Babylon, Nabonidus, and it specifically mentions and records the order of Cyrus that says to return the people who were exiled by the Babylonians to their homes, and even mentions that the Persian government will support them and help to pay for the rebuilding of their cities and their temples. It does not mention the Jews specifically. It just speaks in general terms about the various people groups. But again, a very nice, interesting synchronism for us. Now, still in this same time frame, we have the opponents of Nehemiah. Nehemiah is one of my favorite books in the Old Testament, especially. And you see that a lot of the challenges that Nehemiah had in rebuilding the wall around Jerusalem, he had some officials there in the local area around Jerusalem who were actively opposing him. So we see them in Nehemiah chapter 6, verses 1. We see Sanballat the Horonite, and what we have here from an archaeological perspective, this is a papyrus from the island of Elephantine, which is it's an island in the Nile in Egypt. And there was a fairly significant Jewish community on this island. And this particular papyrus was a letter to the governor of Samaria, who is identified as Sanballat, asking for his assistance in some personal matters that they had going on with some of the other religious groups on the island. Now, Tobiah the Ammonite, we have a really significant find here. This is actually the palace and the crypt of the Tobiad family, which Tobiah would have been one of them, and this particular structure is not too far outside of Amman, Jordan. And then the last of the three main opponents mentioned in Nehemiah chapter 6 is Geshem the Arab. And what we have is this find in Tel El Mashkuta is a libation bowl, basically like a drink offering or something like that. You would put that in this bowl, and the inscription on this bowl is Gesher, King of Kedar. And all of these artifacts have been dated to approximately the time of Nehemiah, which would have been about 445 BC. So let's transition from synchronisms in history to culture, and let's look at some more boule. We have several here that we can take a look at. We have the boule of Gamaliel, Yehukal, and Gedaliah. So we'll look at them each in turn. Here is the Gamaliel boule or bula. This particular individual is listed in Jeremiah chapter 36, verse 10. This particular boule or bula was found in an excavation of the city of David, the old part of Jerusalem, just south of the Temple Mount in the 1980s. So it is appropriately provenanced. It does say Gamaliel, the son of Shaphan. And we know that Gamaliel was a royal secretary. There is some thought that his father Shaphan was a priest and could very well have been the priest who found and brought the book of the law to Josiah, which that occurred in 2 Kings chapter 22 after it had been lost. So again, a nice little comparative here. Now, Yehukal is mentioned in Jeremiah 37:3 and 38:1. This particular bula was found in a similar excavation, not very far from the previous one in the city of David, and it was found in 2005. Now, what we do know from the biblical account is Yehukal was the son of Shelemiah, and he was some sort of government official. We're not really sure of what sort. And now our last bula to discuss was Gedaliah. He is also mentioned in Jeremiah 38:1, 40 verse 8, and then also 2 Kings 25, verse 22. One of the reasons why he gets so many mentions is he was actually a political opponent of Jeremiah. The Bula says Gedaliah, son of Pashur. And so during the reign of King Zedekiah, he was a fairly significant political official. This also was found in excavations of the city of David, and it was found in 2008. Okay, moving from clay boule to fire baked bricks. We talked during the Exodus about, and even before that, about the common aspect of using mud bricks in the ancient Near East for building structures. The ones we were talking about, those were generally going to be sun-dried bricks. And what we also found was those bricks required a great deal of maintenance. They would deteriorate very easily through weather and various other aspects. But one question that we can ask ourselves from the accounts in the book of Daniel: why was there a large furnace in Daniel chapter 5 that was all ready to throw Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego in? Well, the Babylonians were noted for building with kiln-fired bricks. Now, why would they do this? Well, now these bricks that were fired in these ovens or in these furnaces were much harder and much more durable. They held up to the weather better. They were made for stronger structures and so forth. So why didn't everyone do this? Well, this was an extremely expensive operation because in most of these areas of the ancient Near East, there is not a ready source of wood, and you really had to have lots of wood to burn these furnaces hot enough. And in the quantities of bricks, you're building millions, or you're making millions and millions of bricks to build some of these large structures. So the Babylonians would basically have to import wood, would import timber down the Tigris and Euphrates rivers in order to fire these millions and millions of bricks. So this just shows you almost the degree of wealth of the Babylonian Empire. Now, an interesting side note to this: the durability of these bricks kind of cut both ways. The Babylon was built primarily of these kind of fire baked bricks. However, for the longest time, we had difficulty finding the city of Babylon, or really, in the excavations, really finding a lot of evidence of it, because the durability of these bricks was so high that over the years, people would dismantle the ruins of Babylon in order to build adjacent cities. A good portion of the old part of Baghdad in the medieval times was built from the fire baked bricks of Babylon in the ancient times. So there was less and less of the city remaining for discovery, just because of how durable that material really was. So that finishes us up for this session. We'll talk just a little bit about references. You see, we still have ORAT on the reliability of the Old Testament and the Harvest Handbook of Bible Lands. A new reference that I brought up in this one is Lost Treasures of the Bible by Clyde Fant and Mitchell Reddish. This book is really nice in that it has lots of pictures. Each one of the artifacts, it will have a couple of really nice close-up pictures, and then a discussion of the artifact itself, and then also the significance of it to the Bible. And these are all, and then it'll also tell you what museum it's in, so that you could actually go to see it. So that's also a nice reference if you're particularly interested in that sort of thing. Now, we will begin to move into the New Testament in our next session.